How's it going, Spare Parts Army? I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. So we've seen Russia's most prolific tank, the T-72, get absolutely destroyed in Ukraine. And a lot of people are starting to wonder, what the heck went wrong with this tank? Is it a hardware problem, or was it simply human error? Human error was actually my nickname growing up. In this video, we're going to examine why the Russian armored philosophy hasn't really worked on the modern battlefield, and what they could have done to fix it in hindsight. Autoload a shell into your smoothbore cannon, fire off around at that like and subscribe button if you enjoy this video, and let's move out, hooah! When I'm researching these videos, I run into one problem all the time, where I need to verify and vet each news source to know how it's biased in one direction or another, so I can interpret the information correctly. Ground News is a website and app that has solved this problem by clearly showing me how breaking news is being covered across the entire political spectrum. It even helps show me where some of my potential blind spots are in my research. Ground News allows me to swipe between headlines to see how the same exact story is being framed by the left, center, and right sources. I customize my feed to include military and geopolitical topics that relate to our military near peers like Russia and China. The best part of Ground News is it holds me accountable. So for instance, if I read too many stories with a bias on one side, the app actually shows me that. My viewers appreciate that I try my best to be open about my bias, and I try to be impartial with the facts. If you're looking for a better way to stay informed about current events, check out Ground News by visiting the link in the description to download the free app. I think it's safe to say that the backbone of the Russian army and their entire doctrine revolves around its tanks, and the most commonly used one is the T-72. So to give the devil his due here, this tank is very fast moving, it's lightweight, and its 125mm cannon gives it incredible firepower. Above all else, this tank is incredibly dirt cheap to produce at only $500,000 compared to the US Abrams $8 million price tag. The T-72 development story, it's really emblematic of the Soviet Union's politics that are marred in petty infighting and egregious corruption. The tracked armored vehicle perfectly fits into the Russian military's doctrine of throwing a ton of armored vehicles at the enemy to try to overwhelm them. A strategy that might have been good 50 years ago, but is coming into question today. There are more than 3 times the amount of T-72 tanks than there are US Abrams in the world. The T-72's performance on the battlefield appears to be lackluster at best. It could be operator error, it could be poor training, it could be outdated design.
Personally, I think the answer can be discovered if we go back and we look at the old Soviet military doctrine. From the US Army's official field manual on the Soviet operations and tactics, it says when confronting an enemy that has taken up defensive positions, the Soviets attempt to strike weak points in the defense and drive to the enemy's rear whenever possible by bypassing his major force concentrations. They would strive to develop penetrations leading to the enemy's rear to topple the enemy defensive structure. Tank armies may be placed in the first echelon for attaining greater speed when terrain and other conditions permit this employment. My analysis of this information is that this strategy worked well in the 80s, but now with this third generation anti-tank systems, it no longer holds up.
So let's take a look at the origins of this vehicle in order to find some clues into the past. The beginnings of the T-72 is a development story that is closely tied and interwoven with the very start of Russian tank manufacturing. Since the early days of the Soviet Union, their military has always relied on the fundamentals of simplicity in design and ease of manufacture. It's the core to their engineering philosophy, and it's out of necessity, right? Because when you need to create equipment for millions of troops, you have to do it on the cheap and on the fast. The pros of having these cheap equipment in large numbers really outweighed the cons. The T-72 didn't simply fall out of the sky one day out of the blue. It's based on the predecessor, the T-62 design, which is a line of tanks that evolved over time since World War II. The T-62, created in 1961, was originally made for its increased armor-piercing capability. It was the first to be capable of firing the armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot round. And this new ammo type and cannon had one job and one job only: penetrate that enemy NATO tank armor, and it did it well. But the T-62 had some problems. Its main gun wasn't big enough, so they needed to upgrade to the T-64, which solved as many problems as it created. It was a small tank that had a bunch of mechanical problems with its transmission and its engine and its autoloader. It was an absolute nightmare of a tank. So they began working on the tank that would eventually become the T-72.
Two rival tank teams would end up competing against one another to create the T-72. One team was headed up by Morozov. He was a very famous, legendary tank designer in the Soviet Union who had the backing of the entire government. On the other hand, there was Kartsev, who was younger. He was this enlisted guy who fought in World War II in the trenches. He really had an uphill battle. He was going to have to convince all of the influential people in the Soviet government that his design was the best way to go.
There was political friction at the Russian tank plant Uralzavgavad, where the changing of the leadership there became a really sticky situation. The old director of the company resigned, and the new director in charge really opposed the entire idea of the T-72 tank that Kartsev was working on. He even called it a strategic mistake. This put Kartsev at odds with the most powerful people in the Soviet tank building world. And when you're up against that kind of bureaucracy, things usually don't work out well for you. In 1964, as Kartsev is trying to build a tank that will beat Morozov's rival tank design, a Soviet official visits Kartsev at his office and warns him that what he's doing is wrong. He accuses Kartsev of scheming and backstabbing by setting up a rival tank option. So he shows off his prototype to the Soviet minister, who is wildly impressed because he sees that Kartsev has solved a lot of the design problems that were plaguing his rival team, Morozov's tank. Kartsev had created an autoloader that worked well, and his engine was more reliable. The Soviet military runs a series of tank tests in front of all the military officials, not just the one who hates Kartsev. At this test, it's plain as day to anyone with eyes that Kartsev's tanks are superior. So he essentially wins and is able to go over the heads of the officials who didn't like him. It was fully adopted in 1973, but Major General Kartsev was dismissed and retired by the state. All of the state prizes and awards for the development of the tank were sent to his opponents instead. It wasn't until after the fall of the Soviet Union that he began to receive some recognition. Three men who worked with Kartsev, they were the ones that spoke out after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they confirmed stories of Kartsev and how he worked on the T-72 and what really happened. So what was so special about the T-72 that it made it win out above the petty considerations of politics and corruption? It offered a new, larger 125mm main gun that could penetrate US and NATO heavy armor. It used the same base armor composite instead of the older homogeneous cast steel. The vehicle required a smaller 3-man crew as opposed to the traditional 4-man crew thanks to its reliable autoloader. If the autoloader on the T-72 broke down, you could manually crank it by hand. The tank could carry around 40 rounds of ammunition. It weighed 41 tons, with later models rising to around 44 tons. It used a V12 diesel engine with 780 horsepower, and it could reach a top speed of 47 miles per hour. Full production numbers are estimated at around 25,000 units, not including the older models by other countries, which it's estimated to be around 50,000 total units. Well, let's look at a comparison of the T-72 compared to the Abrams. The T-72 is this tiny little thing compared to the massive American tank, as you can see. So why is it that the Soviets decided to design their tank really small like this? In World War II, the Soviets had a lineup of different tanks, including light, medium, and heavy. So the Soviets decided to invest in the light tank philosophy instead, with the T-72, while keeping that larger main gun on it. The lightweight, cheap direction of the T-72 was then closely paired with Soviet tactics. Masses of tanks support advancing infantry.
The biggest advantage here with the T-72 is also kind of its biggest weakness, because this vehicle was designed to be used by a conscript army, so it's supposed to be easy to operate. But its biggest weakness, because I think what went wrong here, is that conscripts cannot pull off sophisticated tank tactics. It's supposed to be easy to maintain, but that's not the case if all of your corrupt generals are stealing the funds that are meant for maintaining the vehicles. I think the main thing that went wrong with the T-72 isn't so much that they stopped improving on the tank, and more so that the Russian army has clearly failed to invest in the expensive and complicated training necessary to pull off combined operations. Forget about coordinating between the Air Force and the Army. I'm talking about a failure to coordinate between tank units and anti-air units.
Okay, so how did the T-72 fare in combat? Well, during the Cold War, the Soviets were giving out T-72 tanks to everyone and anyone who wanted to get their hands on one of these. Their first use in combat was in the Lebanon War in 1982, and that's where they gained a great reputation. But it was really kind of the last time that we would speak highly of the vehicle. The reason why Russian tanks fell about 10 years behind Western tank technology around this time is because of the fall of the Soviet Union. During the 1990s, the US was focused on improving their tank armor and munitions, while the Russians were focused on trying to prevent total chaos in the wake of their collapse of their form of government. Production of their most modern tank ended in 1992. The last true, brand new Soviet tank design was created over 50 years ago with the T-72. But wait, there's still hope for the T-72. Between 1994 and 1996, during the first Chechen wars, we got more data on how the T-72 performs in combat. There were 0 penetrations of T-72 frontal armor from man-portable anti-tank weapons. The bad news though, the Russians lost 44 T-72s from Chechen hunter-killer teams armed with RPGs. Analysis shows that between 3 and 6 RPG rounds are required to disable a T-72 from the rear, sides, or top of the tank. That's a lot of RPGs. In theory, the T-72 can penetrate Abrams in certain spots, like in the engine compartment and rear, but probably not the front or the sides. What could have been done in hindsight to fix the T-72, knowing what we know today? How could Russia have tailored their tank developments over the past 2 decades to improve its survivability? An emphasis should have been placed on heavier armor. The T-72 isn't large enough of a platform to support increased armor protection instead of relying on explosive reactive armor. More investment in active protection system technology would have improved survivability, but really a complete redesign of the T-72 from the ground up was what was required, because the autoloader keeping the shells in the turret, which if penetrated will cause a cook-off of the ammunition due to the design placement of ammo in the tank. These are fundamental design problems. Also, you gotta remember, the 50 cal machine gun has a weakness of requiring the commander to expose himself in order to fire it. Could the T-72 have performed much better if the Russian military coordination was an amazing A+ fashion? I mean, what if they had achieved air superiority early in the war and they had communicated perfectly with other ground assets during their advance? Would we be having a much different discussion then? Would we be praising the T-72 instead? Thank you for watching Task and Purpose. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy, and check out this playlist on all of our tank videos.